Close your eyes and imagine the North Atlantic in winter, where the ocean is not blue but gray-black, where waves rise like mountains and the spray freezes on contact with metal, turning ships into floating sculptures of ice that grow heavier with each passing hour. February 1942. The convoy is HX-156, 43 merchant vessels laden with war materials sailing from Halifax to Britain, shepherded by a handful of destroyers that are themselves barely adequate for the crossing, let alone for protecting 43 slow-moving targets from the wolf packs of German U-boats that hunt these waters with methodical efficiency. The crossing takes 2 weeks in good weather, longer in storms, and the entire journey is conducted with the knowledge that at any moment a torpedo might find its target, might send a ship and its crew to the bottom in minutes, might transform the ordinary work of sailing into the extraordinary work of dying in water so cold that survival time is measured in minutes rather than hours. Your name is Charlie Jordan. You are 19 years old, a merchant seaman from Liverpool who lied about his age to get this job because the pay is good and because sitting in England waiting for German bombs to fall seemed worse than being at sea, where at least you could move, could take action, could feel like you were contributing to the war effort rather than just enduring it. You serve on the SS Thistleford, a cargo ship carrying steel and aviation fuel and crated aircraft parts, everything the British war machine needs to continue functioning, everything the Germans want to prevent from arriving. The Thistleford is old, slow, vulnerable, exactly the kind of target U-boats prefer because she cannot outrun torpedoes, cannot maneuver quickly enough to evade, can only maintain position in the convoy and hope that the law of averages favors someone else today. The torpedo hits at 0347 hours on February 18th. You are asleep in your bunk when the explosion tears through the engine room, the sound and concussion arriving simultaneously, loud enough to feel in your bones, violent enough to throw you from bed to floor in the darkness. The ship lists immediately, taking on water faster than the pumps can manage, and the order comes quickly over the intercom system that still somehow functions despite the damage. Abandon ship. You have practiced this. Every crew member has practiced this. But practice happens in daylight and calm seas, and the certain knowledge that it is only practice, that you will return to your bunks after the drill and laugh about how seriously everyone took it. This is not practice. This is the hull buckling beneath you, the ocean pouring in through ruptures too large to seal, the cold air mixing with steam from broken pipes and creating fog that makes navigation nearly impossible. You make it to the boat deck wearing only the clothes you slept in, no time for proper gear, no time for anything except movement toward the lifeboats that represent the only possibility of survival. Other crew members are there already, working the davits, lowering boats that swing wildly in the wind, trying to time the release so the boats hit water during a trough rather than a peak, trying to avoid the scenario where a lifeboat capsizes immediately and drowns everyone in it before they can even begin rowing away from the dying ship. You climb into a boat with 11 other men, some of whom you know and some you do not, all of you unified by the simple shared goal of not dying in the next few minutes. The boat hits the water hard, nearly capsizes, rights itself through luck more than skill. You grab oars and row, putting distance between the lifeboat and the Thistleford, which is going down by the stern, her bow rising at an angle that becomes steeper with each passing moment. The aviation fuel has not ignited yet, but the possibility hangs over everything. The knowledge that if fire reaches those tanks, the explosion will be visible for miles, will potentially kill anyone still in the water nearby, will turn the sinking from tragedy into catastrophe. You row until your shoulders burn, until the Thistleford is far enough away that her final moments will not drag you down with her, and then you ship oars and watch as she slips beneath the surface with surprising speed, leaving behind only debris and the faint smell of fuel oil and the absence where a ship used to be. The convoy has not stopped, cannot stop. The destroyers are hunting the U-boat, dropping depth charges that create geysers of water and sound like thunder underwater. But they cannot pause to rescue survivors because pausing makes them targets, makes them vulnerable to the same fate. This is the calculus of convoy warfare. The many matter more than the few. The mission takes precedence over individual lives. Rescue happens only after the immediate threat has passed. So you sit in the lifeboat with 11 other men, watching the convoy's lights recede into the darkness, understanding that you are now alone in the North Atlantic in February, with no guarantee that anyone will come back for you, with survival dependent on weather and luck, and whether the rescue protocols actually function the way they are supposed to.
Dawn comes slowly, reluctantly, revealing an ocean empty except for debris from the Thistleford and one other lifeboat visible perhaps half a mile away, confirming that some of your shipmates survived the sinking, but offering no information about how many total, how many died in the explosion, or drowned in the chaos, or simply disappeared into the cold water. The wind is brutal, steady at 20 knots, with gusts that create whitecaps, and the temperature is well below freezing, turning spray into ice that accumulates on the lifeboat's gunnels and on your clothes and in your hair. Hypothermia is not a possibility, but a certainty, a question of when rather than if, and you understand with terrible clarity that you could survive the sinking only to die from exposure before rescue arrives. Then you hear it, the sound of aircraft engines growing louder, approaching from the east. You look up and see them, two German Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor reconnaissance bombers, long-range aircraft operating from bases in occupied France, searching for convoy stragglers or survivors to report back to the U-boats. They circle overhead, low enough that you can see the black crosses on their wings, low enough that if they wanted to strafe you, they could do it easily, could kill everyone in both lifeboats with a few passes. You have no weapons, no defense, nothing except the hope that German pilots follow some code that prevents them from murdering shipwreck survivors. The condors circle once more, and then they drop something. The packages hit the water near your lifeboat, splash with impacts that send up small geysers, and for a frozen moment you think they are bombs, think this is how it ends, survived the torpedo only to be killed by aircraft dropping ordnance on defenseless men in a lifeboat. But there is no explosion, just the packages floating on the surface, bright yellow canvas containers tied with rope, bobbing in the waves close enough to reach with the oars. You row toward them cautiously, still not quite believing what is happening, still waiting for the trick or the cruelty or the rationalization that will make this make sense within the framework of war, where Germans kill British and British kill Germans, and mercy is weakness that gets exploited. You pull the first package into the lifeboat and open it with hands that shake from cold and adrenaline and confusion. Inside are supplies, survival supplies, tins of food, chocolate bars, fresh water in sealed containers, medical supplies, including bandages and antiseptic, emergency flares, even blankets, thick wool blankets that smell faintly of mothballs and military storage, but represent the difference between freezing to death in the next few hours and surviving long enough for rescue. The second package contains more of the same, enough supplies for both lifeboats if distributed properly, enough to extend survival time from hours to potentially days. The condors circle one more time, low enough that you can see the pilots in their cockpits, can see them looking down at you, can almost convince yourself you make eye contact across the 100 feet of vertical distance separating their world from yours. And then they waggle their wings, the same gesture you have seen in countless films, the universal aviation signal that means acknowledgement, that means we see you, that means good luck. They bank away, climbing into the overcast sky, their engine noise fading until only the wind and waves remain, leaving you and the 11 other men in your lifeboat staring at the supplies with an incomprehension that borders on religious awe. Why? Someone asks, voicing the question everyone is thinking. Why would they help us? No one has an answer. The supplies are real, tangible, impossible to dismiss as hallucination or misunderstanding. German pilots, the enemy, the people whose U-boat just killed your ship and probably killed half your crew, have just given you the tools to survive. The contradiction is too large to process in the moment, too complex to reconcile with everything you have been taught about war and enemies and the nature of conflict between nations. You distribute the supplies between both lifeboats when you row close enough to make the transfer. The blankets go immediately, wrapped around shivering men whose lips are blue and whose hands can barely grip the oars. The food is rationed carefully, small portions now, more later if rescue does not arrive quickly. The water is precious, more valuable than the food, because dehydration in freezing conditions is paradoxically common, the body burning through fluids trying to maintain core temperature. The flares are stored carefully, saved for when you see or hear rescue vessels, not wasted on empty ocean.
The hours pass with agonizing slowness. You row to maintain body heat, to keep blood flowing to extremities that want to shut down, to prevent the hypothermia from advancing past the point of recovery. The conversation in the lifeboat is minimal, energy conserved for the essential work of survival. But everyone is thinking about the condors, about the supplies, about the fact that you are alive because 2 German pilots chose mercy over military advantage, chose to see you as human beings rather than enemy combatants, chose to violate whatever orders or doctrines or cultural expectations governed their behavior. Rescue comes on the second day. A British destroyer detaches from another convoy, responds to the distress signal sent before the Thistleford went down, finds your lifeboats through a combination of navigation and luck and the systematic search patterns that give rescue operations their best chance of success. You are pulled aboard with hands that no longer function properly, muscles locked from 40 hours of cold and stress and rowing. The destroyer's crew wraps you in more blankets, gives you hot tea that tastes like the best thing you have ever consumed, takes you below decks where heat exists and the wind cannot reach you, and the simple act of not being in immediate danger of death feels like a luxury beyond description.
You read the letter 3 times, sitting in your kitchen with tea growing cold in front of you, feeling something crack open in your chest that has been sealed since 1942. You have thought about those pilots occasionally over the decades, but never seriously believed you would find them, never imagined that they might be searching for you with the same intensity that you sometimes directed toward wondering about their fate. The idea that one of them is alive, is reaching out, is asking if you remember, it feels like a gift, like a closing of a loop that has been open for 77 years. You write back immediately, your own handwriting shaky now with age, but driven by urgency, by the need to respond before time or circumstance makes response impossible. You tell Klaus Weber that yes, you remember, that the supplies saved your life and the lives of 11 other men in your lifeboat, that you have thought about that act of mercy for 77 years and never understood why it happened, but always been grateful that it did. You tell him you would like to meet if such a thing is possible, if he is well enough to travel, or if you should come to Germany, if there is any way to have the conversation that should have happened in 1942, but could only happen now, in 2019, with both of you improbably still alive. His response arrives within 2 weeks. He cannot travel, his health is too fragile, his mobility too limited, but you are welcome to visit him in Hamburg, more than welcome. He has arranged everything through the care facility and the veterans organizations, has marshaled resources to make the meeting possible because he understands, as you do, that time is now the enemy, that at 97 every day is borrowed, and the window for this conversation is measured in months at most, possibly weeks. You fly to Hamburg in October 2019, the first time you have been in Germany since the war, the first time you have voluntarily entered what was enemy territory, what your generation was taught to fear and hate and destroy. The flight is easy, comfortable in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to your 19-year-old self, and you think about the condors as the plane crosses the North Sea, think about the distance between modern commercial aviation and the military aircraft that circled your lifeboat 77 years ago. Think about how technology evolves while human nature remains stubbornly constant, still capable of cruelty and mercy, still making choices that echo across decades. The care facility is clean, modern, filled with elderly Germans who lived through the same war you did, but from the other side, who carry their own versions of the same memories. Klaus Weber is in a common room when you arrive, sitting in a wheelchair with a blanket over his legs, his face deeply lined, but his eyes still sharp, still alert. He sees you, and something passes across his expression, recognition perhaps, though you have never met, or simply the acknowledgement that this moment has weight, has significance that transcends the ordinary interactions of elderly men in care facilities. You cross the room and extend your hand. He takes it with a grip that is surprisingly strong despite his age, despite the wheelchair and the blanket and the obvious frailty. For a long moment, neither of you speaks, both overcome by the simple, impossible fact of being in the same room 77 years after the event that connected your lives. "You came," he says, finally, in heavily accented English. "I was not certain you would come." You shake your head, still holding his hand. "I had to. I owed you my life. I have owed you my life for 77 years. The conversation that follows unfolds over hours, stretching through the afternoon into evening as staff members bring tea and eventually dinner, as the light through the windows shifts from gray daylight to the amber glow of sunset to the artificial brightness of institutional lighting. Klaus tells you about the mission, about the debate in the cockpit when they spotted your lifeboats, about the pilot, a man named Friedrich Müller, who died in 1987, who Klaus wishes could be here for this meeting, but who at least lived long enough to know the war ended, to return home, to build a life beyond the cockpit of a Condor. Friedrich was the one who made the decision, Klaus explains. As pilot and aircraft commander, the choice was his. They had emergency supplies aboard, standard equipment for long-range reconnaissance missions, in case they had to ditch over water, in case they became the ones needing rescue. Friedrich looked down at your lifeboats and saw men who would die without help, and he could not reconcile that with his conscience, could not fly away knowing he had the means to save lives and chose not to because those lives belonged to the enemy. So he ordered the drop, violated standing orders, put his career and possibly his freedom at risk, because the alternative, letting you freeze to death when he could prevent it, was unacceptable to whatever moral code governed his actions beneath the uniform and the ideology and the machinery of war. We never reported it, he says, his voice quiet with the weight of confession. The mission report said we spotted survivors and noted their position for U-boat command. We did not mention the supply drop. Friedrich said if command asked questions, he would take full responsibility, would say I was following orders and had no choice, but no questions came. I think perhaps other crews were doing similar things, showing mercy when they could, and everyone understood that some acts are better left unreported. You tell him what happened after, the 40 hours in the lifeboat, the rescue, the remaining war years working convoys, the sinkings you survived, and the men you knew who did not. You tell him the supplies bought you time, that without them, hypothermia would have killed most of your lifeboat's crew before rescue arrived, that the blankets and food and water were literally the difference between life and death. You tell him you never forgot, never stopped wondering about the pilots, never quite understood why they helped, but always been grateful that they did.
I had children because of what you did, you say, and the words come out rougher than intended, choked with emotion you did not expect to feel this intensely after so many decades. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, an entire family exists because you and Friedrich chose mercy over orders. How do I thank you for that? How do I express gratitude for 77 years of life I would not have had? Klaus shakes his head slowly, his own eyes bright with tears he does not bother to hide. You do not thank me. You thank Friedrich, who made the choice. You thank whatever spirit or God or chance put us over those coordinates at that moment. You thank the fact that sometimes, even in war, men remember they are human before they remember they are soldiers. There is another visitor that afternoon, arriving late, a woman in her 60s who Klaus introduces as his daughter, Anna. She has brought something, a photograph, old and faded, showing two young men in Luftwaffe uniforms standing beside a FW-200 Condor, both grinning with the confidence of youth and survival and the belief that they are invincible. Klaus points to himself in the photo, then to the other man. Friedrich, he says simply. This was taken in France, spring 1942, a few months after your rescue. I want you to have it. I want you to know what he looked like, the man who saved you. You take the photograph with hands that tremble, studying Friedrich's face, younger than you expected, barely older than you were when the Thistleford sank, just a young man doing an impossible job in impossible circumstances, and somehow finding room within that impossibility for mercy. You try to memorize his features, try to connect this face with the distant glimpse you had of pilots in a cockpit 77 years ago. Try to bridge the gap between abstract savior and concrete human being. Did he know, you ask Klaus? Did Friedrich know you were looking for survivors? Did he die knowing whether we lived? Klaus nods. I told him. Years after the war, when we were old men comparing memories, I told him I had tried to find out what happened to the British sailors from that lifeboat. But there were no records accessible to me, no way to cross-reference German and British archives, no way to know if the rescue came in time. He died wondering, as I have wondered, whether the choice mattered, or whether you froze to death before help arrived. Tell him, you say, though Friedrich has been dead for 32 years, though the message can only be delivered to memory or prayer or whatever exists beyond the boundary of life. Tell him it mattered. Tell him I lived. Tell him he saved 12 men, and those 12 men had families, and those families exist because he could not fly away from people who needed help. The meeting extends into a second day, then a third. You stay at a hotel near the care facility, visit Klaus each morning, spend hours in conversation that ranges across the war and its aftermath, across the decades of separate lives that somehow remained connected by that single act of mercy in February 1942. You meet other residents of the facility, other German veterans, who express variations of the same complicated relationship with their service, pride in having survived, shame about what their nation did, confusion about how to reconcile the ordinary goodness they see in themselves with the extraordinary evil they participated in, or witnessed, or failed to prevent. On your final evening, Klaus gives you one more gift, Friedrich's logbook from the war years, preserved by his widow and passed to Klaus after Friedrich's death. The entry for February 18, 1942, is brief, clinical, following the official format required by Luftwaffe regulations. But in the margin, in smaller handwriting, is a note, dropped emergency supplies to British survivors, could not do otherwise. God forgive me if this was wrong. You return to Liverpool carrying the photograph and the logbook like relics, like physical proof that the memory you have carried for 77 years was not embellished or distorted by time, but actually happened the way you remembered it, actually meant what you believed it meant. Your children and grandchildren gather when you return, sensing that something significant occurred in Germany, that the trip was more than simple tourism or nostalgia. You show them the photograph of Friedrich Müller, tell them about Klaus, explain that these men, these German pilots, these former enemies, gave you the supplies that kept you alive in February 1942. That every birthday and Christmas and ordinary Tuesday since then exists because 2 young men in a Condor chose mercy over military doctrine. Your granddaughter, who is studying history at university, asks the question that has been hovering unspoken beneath the entire conversation. Were they Nazis? She asks, it carefully, aware that the question might cause pain, but unable to avoid it, unable to reconcile the story of mercy with her understanding of what Germany represented during the war. You consider this seriously, remembering Klaus's careful explanations, his acknowledgement that he served the Reich, that wearing the uniform implicated him in everything the regime did, regardless of his personal beliefs or actions. They were Germans, you say, finally. They were Luftwaffe. They served a cause that was evil, but they were also men who saw other men dying and could not accept it, who risked their careers and possibly their lives to drop supplies to enemy sailors they had no obligation to help.
The conversation with Klaus continues through letters and occasional phone calls over the following months. His health declines steadily, the inevitable progression of age and accumulated illness that no medicine can fully arrest. But his mind remains sharp, his need to talk about the war and its meaning undiminished by physical frailty. He tells you about the other missions, the convoys spotted and reported, the ships that were sunk based on his reconnaissance, the British and American sailors who died because he did his job efficiently. He is not asking for absolution. He understands that dropping supplies to one lifeboat does not erase the deaths his reports caused. But he needs you to know the full picture, needs you to understand that mercy and violence coexisted in his service, that he was not simply hero or villain, but both, neither, human. Klaus Weber dies in March 2020, weeks before the pandemic transforms the world in ways neither of you could have predicted during your October meetings. His daughter contacts you with the news, tells you his final weeks were peaceful, that he spoke often about your visit, that knowing the supplies reached you and made a difference brought him comfort in a way that surprised his family, as though this one confirmed act of goodness mattered more than all the other complexities of his wartime service. She asks if you would like anything from his effects. You request only one thing, his navigator's logbook, the companion to Friedrich's pilot logbook, so you can keep both records together, so the story remains complete. The logbooks sit on your desk now, 2 thin volumes bound in cracked leather, filled with coordinates and weather reports and the bureaucratic language of military aviation. But in the margins are the human notations, the small deviations from official format that reveal personality, doubt, conscience. Friedrich's note about the supply drop, Klaus's entry 2 days later. F made the right choice. I would have done the same. Small rebellions against the dehumanizing machinery of war. Small assertions that beneath the uniforms and the ideology and the violence were men who still believed some things mattered more than orders. You are 98 years old now, living in the same Liverpool neighborhood where you grew up, watching ships enter and leave the harbor from a window in your care facility. Most of your generation is gone. The merchant sailors and the U-boat crews and the Luftwaffe pilots and everyone else who remembers the war as lived experience rather than historical abstraction. Soon there will be no one left who can testify from personal memory about what it was like, what it meant, how it felt to be 19 in a lifeboat, watching German aircraft circle overhead and waiting to discover whether mercy or murder would descend from the sky. The historians come occasionally, asking for interviews, wanting to document your story before the window closes, before the last witnesses disappear, and the war becomes entirely the domain of archives and interpretation rather than testimony. You tell them about the Thistleford, about the torpedo and the lifeboats and the condors dropping supplies. You show them the photographs and logbooks, the physical evidence that this happened, that 2 German pilots chose to help rather than harm. And you tell them about Klaus and Friedrich,
about the meeting in Hamburg, about the need both of you felt to close the loop, to transform a wartime encounter into something resembling friendship or at least mutual recognition of shared humanity. What do you want people to learn from this? The historians ask, looking for the lesson, the takeaway, the moral that makes the story meaningful beyond its particulars. You think about this carefully because the easy answers feel inadequate, feel like they flatten the complexity into platitude, that enemies can show mercy, that war does not erase humanity, that individual choices matter even in circumstances designed to make individual choice irrelevant.
I want them to know it happened, you say finally. I want them to know that in February 1942, in the middle of the North Atlantic, 2 German pilots risked everything to save British sailors they had never met and would never see again. Not because they had to, not because it served strategic objectives or ideological goals, but because they could not live with themselves if they did not. That capacity, the ability to choose mercy even when mercy is dangerous, even when mercy contradicts everything you have been trained to do, that is what makes us human. That is what survives when the nations and the causes and the ideologies that demanded the violence have all disappeared into history. You die in your sleep in January 2021, age 98, having outlived Klaus by 10 months, having survived 79 years beyond the morning when German pilots dropped supplies into the North Atlantic and changed the trajectory of your life. The obituary mentions your merchant service, your survival of 4 sinkings, your status as one of the last living witnesses to the Battle of the Atlantic. It does not have room for the full story of the condors and the lifeboats and the meeting in Hamburg, cannot capture the weight of what those events meant or the way they demonstrated that even in war's darkest moments, mercy remains possible. But your family preserves the story. The photographs and logbooks are donated to a maritime museum in Liverpool, where they are displayed alongside other artifacts from the convoy war, labeled with explanations about the incident, about Klaus Weber and Friedrich Müller, and the choice they made on February 18, 1942. Visitors pause at the display, read the logbook entries, study the photographs of young men in uniforms of the Luftwaffe, and confront the uncomfortable truth that the categories of hero and villain, friend and enemy, good and evil are more complex than war propaganda acknowledges, more nuanced than national mythology admits. And sometimes, standing in front of that display, people understand something that cannot be taught but only witnessed. That war demands we see each other as abstractions, as targets, as categories defined by uniform and nationality and ideology. But beneath those abstractions are human beings who bleed and freeze and fear death, who sometimes recognize that fact in each other, even across the lines of battle, who occasionally choose mercy over mission because mercy is the last assertion of individual conscience against the collective machinery of violence. The ocean remembers nothing. The lifeboats are long gone, dissolved into rust and memory. But the story endures. not as propaganda or mythology, but as testimony to a moment when 2 pilots and 12 sailors discovered that the space between enemy and human is thinner than anyone wants to admit. That crossing that space requires only the courage to see clearly and act accordingly, even when seeing and acting contradicts everything war demands. This is the legacy, not victory or defeat, not nations rising or falling, but 12 men who lived because 2 others chose mercy. And in that choice, in its costs and consequences, and the 79 years it echoed forward, lies proof that we are never only what war makes us, that humanity persists in the cracks between orders, that sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes, decency survives even when survival seems impossible.